She would be arriving home soon, just as she always did when the kids stepped off the school bus. The drapes were drawn, shielding the living room from the depressing glare of sunlight. Today, however, the dimness felt oddly comforting. I dreaded the impending confrontation, feeling unprepared both mentally and emotionally to face it. My greatest fear was my own anger, a trait I struggled with since childhood. Unsure of how to navigate this as an adult, I knew it had to be swift. The school bus would arrive in an hour. They mustn't find out. I was determined to shield them from the truth at any cost. A decade of marriage now seemed like wasted time, filled with shattered plans and unfulfilled dreams. There was no hopeful future to envision, only emptiness. A rational man would have been strategizing about what to say or how to approach the impending conversation. Yet, every attempt at planning left me grasping at self-pity. It was unacceptable to wallow in my own sorrow, especially considering the potential impact on my children. Despite my efforts, no clear plan emerged, leaving me foolishly awaiting the inevitable. As I drained the last of the lukewarm beer, she walked in through the door, breaking the silence. "Jake, why are you sitting here in the dark?" Her voice pierced through the room as she moved to draw open the drapes. "Please let them stay closed for a while," I insisted. It was an unusual circumstance. I was never home in the middle of the day. Typically, I'd be at work. Perhaps that was part of the issue. She seemed contemplative as she set down her purse and jacket. "Are you feeling unwell?" she inquired. "No, just overwhelmed with sadness and disappointment," I confessed. "Would you like to talk about it? Is there anything I can do?" she offered. "There's nothing you can do, but I do want to talk. I'm just not sure how or where to begin," I admitted. "Is everything all right at work?" she probed further. "Stop. Please just stop," I interrupted. "Sit and listen. I'll say what needs to be said as best I can. You don't need to respond. Actually, I'd prefer it if you didn't say anything." Susan complied, her gaze fixed on her hands. I overheard her softly muttering to herself, "Oh, crap." "I know about you and Steve Powell," I stated bluntly. She slowly raised her eyes to meet mine, and even in the subdued lighting, I could detect the hint of moisture in them, almost tears. She began to speak, but I gestured for her to pause. I was at a loss. I had no strategy. Frustrated, I hurled the empty bottle across the room and stormed out of the front door. She stood, but made no effort to stop me. Recovery. I found myself adrift, unsure of my destination or my next move. Handling such personal matters was uncharted territory for me. Foremost in my mind were the children. Both Susan and I had experienced the turmoil of broken homes in our own upbringing. I had made a solemn vow that my kids would never endure that same pain. Divorce was off the table, as was abandonment. I felt trapped. My first stop was Russell Enterprises. Luckily, I had accrued plenty of vacation time, and securing a week off was no trouble. While I had a small team working under me, they were competent and capable of managing in my absence. My journey at Russell began 12 years ago as an apprentice draftsman, and now I held responsibility for the entire graphics office, overseeing a small group of maintenance personnel. My hard work had been rewarded over the years. It seemed that our planned summer trip to Dollywood was now in jeopardy. I reminisced about how I had met Susan shortly after starting at Russell. The details were always a bit fuzzy to me. It was some sort of barbecue at one of the engineers' houses. I was there, and suddenly she was there too, by my side. It wasn't like I actively pursued her. She just started talking to me, which was unusual, as girls typically avoided me. I wasn't exactly what you'd call boyfriend material. Too skinny, too tall, too nerdy. Susan had been a year ahead of me in high school and had run with the popular crowd. I distinctly recalled her spending a lot of time with one of the Fonzie wannabes. Yep, you guessed it. His name was Steve. Before we knew it, less than a year had passed, and we found ourselves married and expecting our first child. At the time, it all felt perfectly ordinary and happy. I was content, and Susan appeared to be as well. Susan was a pretty typical person in every respect. She didn't stand out in a crowd or seek attention in any way. To me, she was flawless. A year after our son Thomas was born, our daughter Mandy came into the world. Life was blissful for 10 years. Normally, people splurge on fancy dinners when celebrating something. In my case, I ended up spending an absurd amount at my favorite sushi bar to drown my sorrows. I indulged in every expensive dish I usually passed up. 2 hours later, I found myself at a Best Western hotel, regretting my lavish meal. It seemed the enjoyment was strictly one way. I was much better at consuming than I was at pity parties. I needed a plan. I needed assistance. With a whole week at my disposal, I had time to figure something out. Gathering facts. There was no point in tinkering with insurance, checking accounts, or credit cards. Nothing there needed changing. Our lifestyle would have to remain unchanged. I knew Susan would owe me some sort of explanation, but I dreaded it. If she confessed and I had to accept her version of events, I'd officially become a cuckold. I couldn't see a way around that. Denial wasn't in her nature. The depth of her affair remained a mystery to me. How long had it been going on? How serious was it? Was she planning to leave me? Too many unanswered questions plagued my mind. After some searching, I managed to track down a few old school friends who were aware of Steve and Susan's relationship. What struck me was the absence of any breakup or falling out. As far as they knew, Steve and Susan were always together. Some of them even knew I had married Susan, but that was the extent of it. Steve Powell was the polar opposite of me, charismatic and good-looking. He lacked ambition both academically and career-wise. Despite barely finishing high school, he had spent the last decade working at a local Firestone Tire Company store, primarily as a tire installer. While there's nothing inherently wrong with that, most people in similar positions tend to advance to managerial roles over time. Steve, however, seemed content to remain at the entry level. I was utterly perplexed. What was the allure? I poured my heart and soul into providing for my family, only to be met with betrayal. I suppose other women might have appreciated my efforts, but none had ever shown interest in me. I was with Susan because she wanted me, but then why? I spent the entire day reconnecting with old friends, acquaintances, and classmates. Piece by piece, I began to assemble a clearer picture. Susan and Steve never seemed to have any discord. To everyone's knowledge, they were always together, and many assumed they still were. I had never probed Susan about her relationship with him. I simply didn't want to know. I'd assumed it was ancient history and that she had moved past it. I hadn't harbored any jealousy, suspicion, or concern about our marriage. I guess that was my mistake. Now I realized I had to confront her. It would be a challenging conversation for both of us, and I could only hope that her revelations wouldn't wound me too deeply. Yet, despite this resolve, I remained clueless about what I hoped to achieve or how I would resolve the problem. Answers. The following evening, I managed to secure a small private table at Luciano's. It was a spot where we could converse without fear of being overheard or interrupted. Susan arrived promptly, looking poised but clearly anxious. She sat down, offering a smile, but remained silent. We ordered our meals, ate, and sipped our wine, the atmosphere heavy with tension. Neither of us broached the topic that hung between us like a dark cloud. Eventually, as the coffee arrived, I made the decision to address the elephant in the room. Can we have a discussion without getting swept up in emotional rhetoric? I ventured. Rather than attempting to explain, could you perhaps clarify what specifically you're seeking to understand? It might streamline things, Susan responded. Was this an evasion tactic or a genuine attempt to address my query? How long? I kept my question succinct, hoping for a straightforward answer. 12 years, came her concise reply. Needless to say, I was stunned, and I'm sure my expression betrayed my shock. Susan noticed my reaction and averted her gaze, avoiding eye contact. You've been seeing him for the entire duration of our marriage. I sought confirmation. Yes, she affirmed, her response devoid of elaboration. She sat quietly, awaiting my next question, while I struggled to maintain composure. Part of me wanted to bolt from the table, but I knew I needed more answers. I signaled the waiter for coffee refills, realizing that things weren't unfolding as I had anticipated. Why did you marry me? I posed the question, aiming for simplicity, though I anticipated a complex response. In short, because you could provide me with what he couldn't or wouldn't, Susan replied. Her answer sparked a flurry of new inquiries. I hesitated, not wanting to disrupt the flow of conversation. Surprisingly, I found myself able to contain my rising temper. In fact, I realized I was becoming engrossed in the unfolding dialogue. But why me specifically? I pressed further. I didn't choose you. He did, she admitted. Susan, we've come to a juncture where abbreviated responses won't suffice. I need a thorough explanation. I promise to listen without interruption, I urged, sensing the need for clarity. All right, but before I begin, please believe me when I say there was never any intention to cause harm or disrespect you in any way, Susan prefaced her forthcoming explanation. Despite the deliberate betrayal that had made me a cuckold, I acknowledged her sincerity. I nodded, signaling for her to proceed. Steve and I shared a deep bond for many years and pledged ourselves to each other. We were truly in love, just like the stories you find in movies and cheesy romance novels. It may sound cliché, but we were genuine soulmates. However, we faced a major obstacle we couldn't overcome. I yearned for a home and a family, while Steve staunchly refused to entertain the idea. After countless discussions, we reluctantly agreed to seek out a surrogate husband. We were clueless about how to go about it, but it seemed like the best option at the time. Finding the right person wasn't easy. We needed someone who could offer stability and companionship. In the end, Jake, you emerged as our top choice. Believe it or not, you were the cream of the crop. That's why we chose you, Susan explained. I signaled to the waiter for coffee refills, finding the situation increasingly absurd. Susan, forgive me for interrupting, but are you saying that the plan was for me to live with you as your husband while maintaining Steve as your lover and soulmate? I sought clarification. Yes, she confirmed. Are the children mine? I asked, trying to grasp the extent of the deception. Yes, if you have doubts, you're welcome to verify, she replied calmly. Returning home, the night drew to a close all too quickly. I found myself rendered speechless, the conversation fading into an uncomfortable silence. We sat there, locked in a silent exchange, both grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. While a myriad of questions swirled in my mind, I felt the need to maintain composure, fearing any outburst could derail the fragile equilibrium. I needed time to digest the bombshell dropped on me, to process the revelations in solitude and without interruption. The ensuing days weighed heavily on me, suffused with a profound sense of melancholy. It baffled me how easily Susan had accepted me as her partner while harboring such intense feelings for Steve. The thought of their preconceived arrangement, involving intimacy between Susan and me, gnawed at my mind. Had Steve convinced her to sleep with me, or had she persuaded him to go along with it? Reflecting back, I struggled to pinpoint moments of intense romantic involvement between them. Their interactions appeared platonic and casual. Most of my discoveries stemmed from stumbling upon a text message on Susan's phone, sparking a deeper investigation that confirmed my suspicions. While my investigation could only delve into recent events, I noted their infrequent rendezvous, occurring once or twice a month at best. It hardly resembled a passionate affair. The messages exchanged were devoid of any explicit content, resembling more a mundane scheduling of appointments than declarations of desire. I was certain Susan had brought Steve up to speed on our current predicament, and I suspected they had convened to strategize their approach. Susan had informed the children that I was away on a business trip, and to maintain semblance of familial stability, I returned home, resuming normalcy as best I could. By week's end, I had resettled into the house and reclaimed my place in our bedroom. Save for the absence of intimacy, our lives appeared to have returned to their former routine. I decided to join a gym, not because I was overweight or out of shape, but because I felt like I was suddenly in competition for my own wife, even though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to remain with her. While I lacked a specific plan, I was driven to improve my physical condition and overall health. I began waking up earlier, starting my mornings with a protein shake before heading straight to the gym while the rest of the house still slept. After my workout, I'd shower at the gym and head directly to work. My routine consisted of alternating between cardio and high-intensity interval training and weight training, with each day becoming more consumed by my obsessive commitment to exercise. I found myself logging longer hours at work, often volunteering for additional trips and seminars, anything to escape for a while. Despite the circumstances, I was surprised by how normal my relationship with Susan appeared on the surface. We avoided discussing the elephant in the room, the problem looming between us. The only noticeable difference was in the bedroom. Our intimacy was strained, reflecting the uncertainty and lack of direction we both felt. We existed in a state of limbo, devoid of any plan or vision for the future. It felt as though I was cohabiting with a roommate whom I shared a bed with. I recognized I needed assistance. Evaluations. Spending an hour on the treadmill or C2 rower 4 days a week afforded me ample time for reflection. Despite the betrayal, I cherished being married. I couldn't picture myself with anyone other than Susan, yet I grappled with conflicting emotions. The more I pondered, the more perplexed I became. She was my wife, yet she was involved with someone else. Did that automatically classify me as a cuckold? Or was it more nuanced? After all, the man she was involved with had been her partner long before I entered the picture. Was she cheating on me with him, or was I unwittingly drawn into their tangled dynamic? It was easy to confuse myself. Did the mere existence of a marriage license dictate the parameters of fidelity, or was it dictated by the perception of the relationship? Susan and Steve held divergent views on family and marriage. Somehow, unwittingly, I found myself entangled in their turmoil, utilized as a pawn to resolve their conflict. To appease Susan, Steve had to sacrifice his own desires, allowing me to be with her. Considering their close bond, this decision must have weighed heavily on him. Yet despite my pivotal role, I couldn't shake the feeling of being used, a sentiment I found unsettling. Despite this, I couldn't deny feeling as though I had come out ahead in this peculiar arrangement. I endured my internal quandary for about 2 weeks before reaching a decision. Since divorce or departure were not options, I resolved to continue sleeping with Susan. I vowed to resist bitterness and vengeance. However, before embarking on this new phase of my marriage, I concluded that certain ground rules needed to be established. That afternoon, I made a reservation at Luciano's for dinner. The agreement. The evening unfolded in a familiar, hesitant rhythm, mirroring our previous encounter. Susan appeared reluctant to broach any conversation, and I found myself similarly unable to initiate. The waiter's interruption, though mundane, served as a catalyst for dialogue. "Can I get you anything else?" the waiter interjected, breaking the silence. "Just another coffee refill, please," I responded, seizing the opportunity to break the ice. "I suppose we should wrap up. It seems they're eager to close," I remarked, glancing around the restaurant. "Susan, I'd like things to return to normal, if possible. Under the circumstances, there are a few agreements I think we should make. It's nothing overly complicated, and if you disagree, I'm open to alternative suggestions," I began, seeking her consent. She nodded, offering a small smile, prompting me to continue. "Firstly, I'd like to resume sleeping together. There might be initial challenges, but I hope with time we can overcome them and establish a sense of normalcy. Is that acceptable to you?" I inquired. Susan nodded, silently mouthing the word, "okay." "Secondly, I propose we continue living together as husband and wife until the children are grown. Once they've left home, we'll quietly pursue a divorce and part ways. With Mandy approaching college or marriage, we're looking at roughly 10 years. Can you commit to that?" I laid out my plan. There was a pregnant pause, as if Susan was carefully considering my proposition. "So, if everything goes smoothly, we'll stay together until the kids are grown, and then we'll split up?" She sought clarification. "No," I interjected firmly, cutting off any room for ambiguity. "Once the children have moved out, we will split up. It won't be up for discussion." "But what if?" Her sentence trailed off, left unfinished. I waited, hoping for a definitive response. Finally, she looked up, silently mouthing the word "okay" once more, but this time devoid of any smile. "Lastly," I continued, broaching a delicate topic, "I'm not comfortable with the situation, but I understand if you want to maintain your relationship with Steve. However, I insist that you keep it discreet. I won't interfere or waste energy trying to end it." Before I could finish my sentence, I rose from my seat, placing money on the table and pulling out Susan's chair. The atmosphere between us had grown tense, and I had no desire to linger. The drive home was fraught with silence, and we spent the night sleeping separately, our unresolved issues lingering in the air. My big mistake. The terms I laid out were never explicitly discussed. It was as if they were tacitly accepted the moment they were presented. Gradually, we resumed sleeping together. Initially, it was awkward, but with time, we grew accustomed to each other again, and things improved. Our home life reverted to its usual rhythm. What struck me as most peculiar was how my perception began to shift over time. While technically I was being cuckolded, I started to view the situation differently in my mind. Susan belonged to Steve. She always had. However, I found solace in the fact that I could use her however I pleased, whenever I pleased, and there was nothing Steve could do about it. Yes, I provided for her, but I convinced myself that it was merely repayment for her services and her role in caring for the children. Unaware of the times she spent with him as agreed upon, ignorance became my shield. One day, when my car required an oil change, I decided to take it to the Firestone store where Steve worked. As my car was serviced, I stood in front of the glass window overlooking the service department, fixating on my wife's lover. Initially oblivious, he eventually noticed my presence, though he had likely seen me before, never under these circumstances. He worked at the tire brake machine for nearly an hour under my gaze, and I remained unwavering. When my car was finally ready, I moved away from the window and departed. His discomfort did little to assuage my feelings, though perhaps it provided a small sense of redemption. A week later, I brought Susan's Honda in for an oil change and repeated my silent vigil. After about 30 minutes, Steve halted his work, fixing his gaze on me. With a smirk, I flashed him a 2 thumbs up sign, relishing the moment. Though my words were inaudible, my gesture spoke volumes. Walking away from the window, I left shortly thereafter. The following day, chaos ensued. Upon returning home from work, I noticed the absence of the children. No dinner awaited me, only Susan. "You rotten son of a bitch," she seethed, her words slicing through the air like a knife. It was just the beginning. I remained seated as she circled the kitchen table, her eyes blazing with fury. For 10 years, Steve and I never once humiliated or disrespected you. For 10 years, we showed you every consideration to keep things running smoothly. And now you decide to act like an asshole. You go to his workplace and make a spectacle of him, insulting him in front of his colleagues and laughing about it. You have everything: a nice home, a good job, wonderful kids, and a wife. He has nothing, yet you feel the need to push him even further down. It was a despicable thing to do, and right now, I am ashamed to be your wife. I remained motionless. She was right. We have an agreement, and I'm willing to uphold it. But if you ever embarrass me like that again, I'll walk out that door and take the kids with me. I offered no response. "Do you understand?" she pressed. "Yes," I replied quietly. "Good. I'm going to take a shower. Order a pizza from Domino's. The kids are staying at your parents' house tonight." As I awaited the pizza, a realization dawned on me, one that I couldn't ignore. I had acted like an asshole. Moving on. The following day, Susan reverted to her usual self, and my foolish actions were never brought up again. I made a conscious decision to steer clear of the Firestone store altogether. Instead, I poured my energy into my work and tending to the needs of our children. For the next few years, life unfolded smoothly, as if those tumultuous weeks had been wiped from our collective memory. I refrained from any form of surveillance on Susan, not out of indifference, but rather a desire to avoid knowing. My dedication to Russell Enterprises paid off with increased pay and promotions. I found myself also overseeing the EDP department, despite my initial lack of expertise in that area. However, my knack for effective leadership compensated for any gaps in knowledge. To our friends and relatives, we continued to present ourselves as a content-loving family, successfully masking any past issues. To my knowledge, our children remained oblivious to the turmoil. Surprisingly, bitterness didn't take root within me. I genuinely cherished my relationship and companionship with Susan. Occasionally, thoughts of her and Steve crossed my mind, but they were fleeting. In a peculiar twist of perspective, I convinced myself that I wasn't the cuckold, Steve was. I had taken his woman and utilized her for my own ends. It may have been a slightly delusional notion, but it was one I could reconcile with and live with. As Thomas graduated from high school and promptly enlisted in the Air Force, and Mandy secured a generous scholarship to Penn State, we found ourselves facing a pivotal moment. The day after Mandy departed for college, Susan and I sat down for a conversation that had been looming on the horizon. "You knew this day would come," I remarked. "Yes," she acknowledged quietly. "Steve will likely be relieved that it's all finally behind us," I mused, attempting to gauge her reaction. "Jake, I haven't had any contact with Steve in over 6 years. I don't even know where he is," she confessed. It was a relief to hear, though I masked any signs of it. Deep down, I understood why she had severed ties with him, but I wasn't about to reveal that to her. Despite the betrayal, I still harbored love for her, a fact I struggled to convey due to my stubborn pride. Before I could muster the courage to express myself, Susan spoke again, preempting my words. "Jake, if I recall correctly, you said we would stay together as long as the children were still at home. Is that right?" "Yes," I affirmed cautiously. "I'm pregnant," she announced, her words hanging in the air, pregnant with implications. Two stupid people. Things were veering off course from what I had expected. I rose and stepped outside, seeking solace in the open air. Sitting on the porch glider, I gazed into the distance, lost in my thoughts. Susan joined me, her hand finding mine, silent but supportive. Tears welled in both our eyes, revealing the depth of our emotions. It was evident now that she desperately desired to salvage our relationship, and I suspected she had invested considerable effort in orchestrating this moment. "You know I had a vasectomy 6 years ago." I broached the topic, still grappling with the weight of the revelation. "Yes, it was a cruel thing to do, and I believe you regretted it," she responded, her voice tinged with sadness. "Why?" I inquired, genuinely puzzled. "Because it drove a wedge between us, and I didn't want that. I didn't want to lose you," she confessed, her vulnerability laid bare. "I didn't either, but I failed to see how getting pregnant changes anything. If anything, revealing this may have the opposite effect," I countered, struggling to comprehend her reasoning. "I felt I had no other choice. If there was even a glimmer of hope from you, I might have acted differently," she explained, her voice tinged with desperation. "All right, I'll entertain this. Who is the father?" I asked, resigned to confront the truth. Susan retrieved an envelope from her apron pocket and handed it to me. "This cost me over $8,000. I don't know who the father is, but we're going to raise this child as our own. Those were your terms, and I intend to hold you to them." I opened the envelope, revealing the letterhead of the Lehigh Burks Fertility Clinic. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you liked it, please like it and subscribe to the channel. See you soon.